Um, I wanted to make a visual diary or kind of journal for the kind of next phase of my professional development, let's say. I'm currently helping out on a course module called Leadership and Futures, which I thought was kind of a cool name. And as such, I've been using it as an opportunity to reflect broadly on leadership and futures, whatever they are. But before doing that, I figure it's important to look at your past. And so in this kind of first journal, audio, video thing, I want to kind of talk through some of the things that I've done recently in the lead up to this. So before lockdown, the last thing I did was run an event where I interviewed a load of people that I admire and respect about the relationship between art and business and money, kind of a wide selection of themes really. And it really fed into something that I kind of drafted before, but really managed to kind of hone during these interviews, the Extinction Ethnography manifesto. The article I posted up on LinkedIn is the Extinction Ethnography towards a cultural scene. I'll break down each of these three words as I do in the article. So extinction is something you'd probably associate with Extinction Rebellion. Extinction is the undesired consequence of capitalism. I think that extinction can be used in a lot of different ways. One, capitalism is about using and exploiting the planet's resources for personal individual gain. But it also kind of extinguishes certain aspects of personality and character. Capitalism creates types of people, extinguishes their kind of possibilities, their options, their potentialities. So the first part of the manifesto is kind of looking at that, and the ethnography and extinction ethnography. Ethnography is the illumination of social and cultural life. I like the word illumination. It's kind of carrying a torch and shining a light on all these kind of different things that you find as an ethnographer. It comes from anthropology, which is said to be the most scientific of the humanities and the most human of the sciences. It's a real bridge, a bridging discipline. So the idea of extinction ethnography is kind of trying to direct ethnography, so directing the illumination of cultural and social life. I think that's important because ethnography, as I've noticed in business, tends to be geared towards, for want of a better term, selling washing machines, understanding consumer behaviour so that you can more effectively target adverts and innovation around people. Or it's been used for user experience testing. An ethnographer would sit with different types of people, and as they use web platforms, they'd understand their pain points and ways they can make it easier. But I want to kind of, by creating extinction ethnography, I'm trying to align it a bit more with what we can see as an emerging type of, emerging kind of use of this very kind of scientific and humanistic endeavour that kind of makes it a bit more authentic. And then the cultural scene. So I've called extinction ethnography towards a cultural scene. I like the word cultural scene. A scene is something that really kind of defies any kind of top-down planning. A scene is something that emerges, like an art scene or a music scene or a cultural scene. Brian Eno has an amazing term, scenius.
Although great new ideas are usually articulated by individuals, they're nearly always generated by communities. And I think what I see as the waste is the waste that we make of that possibility of cooperative intelligence. Being an artist, you hear a lot of talk about genius, which is the process of singling out certain people in art history and saying those were the important ones, Picasso, Rembrandt, Shostakovich, whatever. Whenever you look at any of those artists, you find that they lived and drew from a very, very active, flourishing cultural scene. And they were only one of the elements in that scene. All these people who are called genius actually sat in the middle of something that I call scenius, SCENIUS. So just as genius is the creative intelligence of an individual, scenius is the creative intelligence of a community. And what I want to see is more attention given to that possibility of creative behavior. So what that means, of course, is two things. One of them is the understanding that all people are born unequal, so everybody has a particular and unique set of gifts and talents, whatever they are. And secondly, that intelligence is generated by communities, by cooperation of some kind.
So I'm hoping that by connecting the concept of extinction and the concept of ethnography together, we start to get towards a kind of a new cultural scene that can have positive effects on the kind of neoliberal capitalist world that we're in, and start to kind of redesign it and reshape it towards a more kind of wholesome, authentic world. So some of the aims are, first of all, to provide radical, profound and transformative insight that shifts mindsets. I kind of think this is where insight should go as a discipline. Radical kind of refers to going to the extreme margins, kind of going to the edges and pulling an insight from there. Profound means that it has real effects. It really changes mindsets. It has something transformative about it. The kind of thing you might get from going to see a really powerful theatre performance, or having a really powerful conversation with a stranger at a bar, and really visceral. That it kind of, it's something that you feel. I think profound has like a sense of feeling about it. It's something you remember. And transformative, yeah, as I say, it shifts mindsets. It makes you think differently. It transforms the way you see. Gives you a new way of seeing reality. The other kind of aim for this cultural scene would be to use the internet to battle alienation and loneliness. There's something really ironic about the fact that, as I can see, isolation and loneliness has increased in the age of the internet. Maybe it's got something to do with all the FOMO and the projected selves that are put on the internet by people. But the irony that when we have this really powerful liberatory tool to connect people, hasn't been used for that. Instead, it's kind of created weird side effects. Should give us pause for thought. So I think that what's needed is to bring people together physically, to pull them away from the internet through diverse and inspirational narratives. And I know I know kind of recording this during the time of COVID is a kind of quite ironic in itself. But then I guess this kind of pause and this kind of enforced social isolation has really made us recognise how important the city is, how the world is, being out and physically speaking to one another. So what we want to oppose are the processes of financialization, which is essentially kind of viewing the world as something to exploit financially. The academic Saskia Sassen writes about financialization quite a lot, and she talks about how finance companies will hire physicists to design the kind of computational algorithms that create more and more complex instruments that create more wealth for the people that have invested in that particular financial company.
Because in fact, I asked myself, when I'm doing this research, well, how much actual money is there in the system? Like if you took all the central banks in the world and the currencies that they issue, which is a very wobbly figure because of inflation, corruption, the printing press, etc. But still, so today it's probably about 350 trillion. The value of finance is a quadrillion. That is a lot. That's another order of magnitude, basically. So that leads me then to say that finance, unlike traditional banking, is not about money, money, currency. Finance is very different from traditional banking. Finance sells something it does not have. Hence, it is extremely creative, using enormously talented people in order to create instruments that allows it to invade other economic sectors. The traditional bank sells something it has, money, and charges you an interest. So that's the big difference, and that is why finance is dangerous. Finance can, it's like in English there is this great expression, grist for the mill. Finance produces grist for its mill by invading all kinds of other economic sectors. And to invade those sectors, it needs brilliant minds to produce the instruments. And so in that sense, finance is a kind of roving machine that is present everywhere, including in poor households, via the nexus of debt.
She also talks about how buildings around the city that are built as a result of this financialization are empty, how people in those buildings would become too risky. So it's actually easier to not have buildings populated. It's a weird way to think, but no one's really in control of this kind of big, kind of impersonal force of financialization that's shaping our city and then shaping us and the kind of personalities and characters that get produced in a city. So we would oppose the process of financialization. We oppose neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a kind of often associated with the 80s, the 70s, a set of policies that really focused on allowing the logic of the market to have like greater freedom. So individual opportunistic behavior was given free rein, and that obviously really came to a crash in the 2008 kind of financial crash. Narcissism, I think, is a really important process to tackle. It's interesting that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, who very much were ancient civilizations that were kind of obsessively focused on the individual human, the individual person, would give us such amazing splendors as the Olympic Games. It would also give us the myth of Narcissus, who famously fell in love with his own reflection and died trying to kind of trying to kiss his own reflection, which was just a reflection in the water. So he eventually starved to death by the banks of the water. And I think that in the age of social media, where we start putting our image online and our voice online, and we start getting lots of feedback, and everyone starts to become famous, the risk of narcissism has never been higher. I believe there are studies that have shown that narcissism is on the increase. Narcissism is a psychological trait that that can be measured, and yeah, I believe that's on the increase, particularly amongst younger people. So yeah, I've written in the manifesto, oppose financialization, extraction, toxicity, colonialism, neoliberalism, narcissism, exploitation. I think colonialism is really interesting as well, especially in places that I've worked recently. The term culture is being used to colonize people's productivity. It's a funny thing that seems to have happened in the finance world. Culture was brought in to help explain kind of the human side of the world, the stuff that you couldn't put into numbers, which is what kind of economic worldviews deal in, all the messy, squidgy stuff. And of course, there's nothing really that the two worlds are completely incompatible. And so I think kind of banks and financial companies trying to work with culture was doomed or failed. But what seems to have happened instead is the concept of culture is being used by those financial companies, by modern corporations, by startups, to create an internal culture, which is based on a very narrow set of ideas that's geared up towards increasing productivity. But rather than it just being something like you got to work these hours and you have to kind of produce this much work, it's kind of makes you want, it's geared up to make you like your work, like your boss, so you are part of a tribe. which limits any kind of ability to resist or to oppose, which is deeply unhealthy, I think, for any kind of social organisation. I think that any kind of healthy society needs to have, I guess, the element of the carnivalesque about it. The carnivalesque is a term used by Bakhtin, a Russian writer, really interesting guy, who talked about carnival as being really important for people on the bottom to lampoon the people on the top, to kind of mock authority, to use their own language, to express their own identity, for like a day or 2 days, to kind of purge, as it were. But companies that have this kind of new type of company culture seem to be kind of removing that possibility by making your boss your buddy. It's I mean, I don't want to be too negative about it. I mean, people do like their work, and it's why we get meaner, and it's nice to have a good working environment. But I think there are some dangerous forces that can be best understood through the concept of colonization, colonialism, and the way that works. It's a kind of not violent way of making people do what you want. It's a more seductive way of making people do what you want. It works at the level of culture. Those are some of the forces that we kind of want to oppose in this manifesto. Some of the things we want to encourage are the kind of stuff you associate more with kind of the natural world. So rewilding, that's kind of allowing places to go kind of wild. I think in the kind of natural sense, you would have it as you'd leave like a patch of ground, like Glastonbury Festival. It cancels every 4th year. It has a fallow year, so that the land can kind of get better again. We could probably start doing that with large parts of the world, kind of moving people around so that places can rewild. But we can use that culturally as well. I think that, to go back to culture and the way business thinks about culture, it tries to kind of extract the life force out of culture. And so wherever there's like a new nascent form that emerges from culture, from a cultural group, whether it's like a new kind of style or a new idea or a new fashion, business will go in and take it. And the market logic is so all-encompassing now that it means that as soon as that form appears, it gets taken and appropriated by business near instantly. And so I think rewilding is an important concept to use culturally, in that we should find areas where business doesn't have any role, that kind of market logic is kept far away. It's not to say that people involved in business don't get involved in these cultural scenes. It's just that it needs to be kind of saved from the kind of logic of commercial exploitation, and allowed to kind of regenerate and rewild. Emergence is a kind of another process to encourage. I think I was talking to somebody about binaries and how kind of emergence happens in the space between binaries. It's a cool term. So kind of on that, we want to kind of, the next kind of aim is to support open source philosophy, which is, if you think about the internet, all the kind of websites and tools and everything you use was built in an open source way. Passionate people, often hippies, came together to create all the kind of backbone and infrastructure of the web. It's kind of ironic now that pretty much every device and platform we use is owned by a corporate interest and controlled by a corporate interest, which makes projects like Wikipedia so amazing. I mean, Wikipedia was made using 1% of the kind of cognitive energy spent by Americans watching TV every year. It's incredible what kind of can happen when the right open source conditions are designed. And a kind of a more modern version of that would be the Creative Commons, where people kind of freely share their art and content to be used. When I think about this stuff, I often think about kind of dub and reggae music from Jamaica. There's no such thing as kind of copyright as such over there. Alternatively, they have versioning. So you'd have like a very kind of small, finite handful of rhythms, and people would just borrow, still use these rhythms and put their own versions on top. And in the kind of sound system culture of Jamaica, it would be this kind of free sharing or use of each other's work, and it kind of becomes like a really rich dynamic discussion. And of course, like all the music we love now essentially stems from this kind of this ecosystem that was created in Jamaica, in very violent conditions as well. It's important to note there was like a very violent, dangerous world, Jamaica, and this kind of sharing emerged from those from that kind of environment, and then would lead to dubstep, grime, drum and bass, all the music we love. The next kind of point is to help people wherever they live or work explore notions of transcendence, self-representation, and the imagination of alternative systems. And I think here's one of the kind of key insights I've had recently, which is, you know, I consider myself a bit of an anarchist. I'm always going to protest in the system whilst being part of the system. But I think the best thing we can do right now is to almost encourage people wherever they are, in whatever kind of role within a business or whatever shop they're working in, to kind of think about their own position and to try and transcend, to try and kind of explore how they can represent themselves. And then I guess the idea here is that if we have lots of people all around the world in all these different positions kind of doing this, then almost like a mycelium field which connects like mushrooms and fungus, there'll be this emergence of kind of energy that will push the world into its next stage of evolution, whatever that is. I really like a line from Sylvia Plath in one of her poems where she talks about mushrooms. That's where I got this idea from. And she talks about the soft fists that insist.
Overnight, very whitely, discreetly, very quietly, our toes, our noses take hold on the loam, acquire the air. Nobody sees us, stops us, betrays us. The small grains make room. Soft fists insist on heaving the needles, the leafy bedding, even the paving. Our hammers, our rams, earless and eyeless, perfectly voiceless, widen the crannies, shoulder through holes. We diet on water, on crumbs of shadow, bland-mannered, asking little or nothing. So many of us, so many of us. We are shells, we are tables, we are meek, we are edible, nudgers and shovers in spite of ourselves. Our kind multiplies. We shall by morning inherit the earth, our foot's in the door.
So I think that's kind of a key part of this manifesto, to kind of go wherever people are, give them the tools they need to self-represent, to explore their own identity, and to transcend in the way that they see fit. And again, this kind of going back to that previous point about company culture. That's why the kind of top-down model of culture we're seeing in businesses is really dangerous, because that's often the vision of a small group of men, normally, who have determined what the culture will be. And this gets in the way of allowing individuals to explore their own cultural identity. The next point is to end advertising attention pollution by radically redesigning the way products, services and experiences are innovated and communicated to people. This is something that really bothers me. I'm really kind of susceptible to adverts. Whenever I go away from London, I always feel really nice, and then as soon as I hit the underground and I'm bombarded with adverts, I start to kind of get that kind of cloying sense of kind of being trapped, I guess, having my attention kind of taken away from me, not being able to have my own thoughts, to wander freely. There are some places around the world which have banned outdoor advertising, and there's a big campaign. The Ad Hack Manifesto is trying to get that done. I think really, if anyone's listening to this and you work in marketing or advertising, stop putting messages out into the world like that. The concept of permission marketing is much better. People who opt in to receive your messages is fair game, but to kind of, if you think about your average billboard, how many people must see that and will have no action whatsoever? 99%. For the 1% of people that will watch the advert or see the advert and make a purchase. So it's a massive waste of people's cognitive time and energy. And I think it's I would really like to see a big existential questioning of how advertising is done by the next generation of businesses. The next kind of point is to end competitive market speak and nurture a communication system based on regenerative language. And I think this is something you get from the poets. They're really kind of aware of this. So often when you talk about business, you talk about kind of campaigns or target markets, or you might say you spent your time in the trenches, but there is a very kind of militaristic, violent vocabulary that you find in business. And that kind of makes sense because the kind of metaphorical system for business has been based on competition and conflict of other people. And I think that if we were to shift those metaphors towards something more regenerative, more collaborative, something based on kind of natural systems and processes, then we'd get a lot more. We'd certainly be able to foster greater, deeper collaboration with other people, as opposed to trying to compete with other people. Again, I think competition has a place, and it's certain types of men or people. Sorry, but I don't know. I mean, in my experience, it's been men that really thrive in that environment. And I think that there's a sci-fi novel I read once where it describes the solar system as being entirely kind of populated, colonized by humans. And of course you can't do that in a capitalist system. You need huge amounts of collaboration to make that happen. But there are some planets where they give kind of capitalist, selfish, competitive drives, like almost like a virile drive, free reign, and it produces beautiful stuff. It's compared to baseball in the novel. And I think kind of practically we should, strip competitive thinking, strip militaristic language away from things like finance, services, food, all the kind of stuff that isn't luxury. Maybe luxury is like a place where we can kind of have that impulse, that type of person. The next point is to cultivate non-commercial spaces that allow for the rewilding of cultural energy, and I touched on that earlier. The idea that we need to kind of keep cultural movements and growth away from commercial market logic, so that it can kind of do its thing. It can spread its kind of vital energy around to people in the city. And so this is one kind of thing that business can start to do now, is to kind of sponsor and create spaces where there's no kind of need to do return on investment, no involvement whatsoever really from business. The irony is that essentially it's making a world in which we can do business tomorrow, a kind of rich, vibrant, diverse world which is really inclusive. So it really requires a more long-term vision. But then by kind of just getting money into these places, again, the people in a business can come to these places. It's not exclusionary. It's just that the focus of it shouldn't be on kind of making money. It should be on, it should be on anything. I don't want to say what it should be on. It should be kind of left to the individuals involved to kind of make that themselves. So yeah, kind of cultivate non-commercial spaces within the city, like physical spaces where people can experiment and explore away from the kind of dominant market logic. And the final kind of aim of this manifesto is to focus on how to use money and profit as an enabling tool, not as an aim. And I think like throughout my career, I've always been told the purpose of business is to make money. And I mean, I've never really seen that. I mean, I'm in business, but I don't really intend to make money beyond what I need to pay my rent and bills. The idea of just making lots of money is really kind of abhorrent. and unnecessary. I think like making the amount of money you need is a much more admirable aim. And then in this view, money becomes like a tool, an enabling tool. So money can do stuff, and that's kind of what the focus of this manifesto is. What can we do with money? How do we get it moving around? How do we think about the relationship between financial capital and cultural capital and social capital, and how do we kind of get the three of those kind of capitalist dynamics working better? So those are the kind of aims of the Extinction Ethnography Manifesto. I kind of wrote this as I hope people enjoy reading it and get behind it or make your own version. But for me, it was really a kind of personal tool just to align what my own value system was and how I wanted to progress with the next stage of my career or my practice. So the next kind of section of this is how will I go about doing that? So the first one is to develop wellness models that are multidimensional and holistic, especially in relation to our complex digital, personal and professional lives. I like the trend of wellness. I think that the focus on kind of mental health and harmony and I think the key word there, multidimensional, is really useful, because wellness is, it's your physical wellness, it's your mental wellness, but your mental wellness is made up of different dimensions. It's like your philosophical, spiritual wellness, it's your social wellness of how kind of connected you are with friends, it's the kind of, are you learning stuff, do you feel that you're being able to represent yourself, as well as the kind of more physical. So I think kind of understanding the role that business plays, that money plays and that art plays in understanding wellness. For me, one of the greatest terms for understanding wellness is rhythm. I think like the idea of discordance and harmony and patterns of time is something that we can all get around. And just like we each have our own taste in music, some people like really fast, loud, heavy metal, some people like kind of quiet, ambient music, some people like both at different times. I think being able to choose your own rhythm and kind of adjust your rhythm to your kind of needs is a good way to think about wellness. So that's kind of one, to kind of explore wellness a bit more in a bit more depth. The next was to kind of focus on designing cultural enrichment programs within organisations that help employees explore their cultural identity. And again, this goes back to the idea that people within organisations or employees should be encouraged to explore themselves, their own personal kind of view of the world, rather than being subject too much to the tyranny of a visionary leader. They should be able to kind of leave the company, really. It's funny, the companies obviously want to keep and retain employees, but really you should try and encourage them to leave. Then they can kind of have a better life. I guess it all depends on what your value system is and what success means to you. The next kind of stage is to equip people with the tools, methods and processes they need to empathise with other cultures and societies. I think like the kind of terms here would be non-violent communication, empathy. Metamodernism is a real interesting concept. That's kind of a key term that we use a lot in Insight OS, which is essentially the collective that I'm part of with other kind of thinkers. Metamodernism is it's basically like a kind of a cultural logic of and instead of or. So it's not this or this, it's this and this. The idea that we can kind of do it all and we don't really need to argue. And that makes sense in the age of the internet, right, where there's no scarcity, there's no need to fight over limited resources to debate who gets what. Everything is infinitely replicable online, and so the whole logic system doesn't really work anymore. So metamodernism is kind of using the terms modernism and postmodernism, and it's the continuation of that. So modernism was all about progress and kind of moving towards a future, whereas postmodernism was like, well, you can't do that. There's whose future? There's no such thing as meaning. But when you kind of combine them together, it's like, well, okay, we learnt a lot from the postmodern era, which was from the 70s to the 90s roughly. But now we need to go back to that kind of, well, we need to move forwards, we need to progress. And there's a certain heroism that we see in the meta-modern cultural logic that you see in perhaps the kind of superhero movies that we're all fans of these days. So yeah, kind of equipping people with the kind of tools they need. The next one is to kind of reimagine the traveller as an environmentally and culturally sustainable explorer. I mean, this has become particularly resonant now that COVID has locked everything down and eliminated travel. My job has been to travel around the world, collecting cultural insight, describing how different markets and cultures and people operate so that we can understand kind of their flows and tailor propositions accordingly. But before then, just as a traveller, I've always had that kind of interested eye. I guess it's kind of rethinking what it is to move around the country, what it is to engage people in other cultures in conversation and dialogue, what that looks like, and how we can perhaps do it in a way that's a bit more beneficial to the global world. I think key here is the term globalization. There is a global culture emerging. You see it in things like food. Veganism itself is a global manifestation. Cinema is really interesting. We had the cultural dominance of Hollywood, but now there's Nollywood from Nigeria, or there's some amazing films coming out of Korea. There's amazing films coming out of everywhere. There's Bollywood, and in Saudi Arabia, where I was recently, there was a strong female kind of filmmaking kind of movement, which, considering the history of Saudi Arabia and its highly oppressive rules around women, is really interesting. But all this kind of cinema is like international cinema on a world stage. So again, it's another indicator of like global culture. So as this kind of increased understanding of global culture, whether it's food or whether it's cinema or whether it's music, we start to understand this, and we start to kind of really see a global community, a global village, to use Marshall McLuhan's terms. What does it mean to travel? And what does it mean to do it responsibly and sustainably, and to share culture? And then to provide the most advanced insight in the most accessible way that's kind of always been my mission. I have a background in studying literary theory, which is very complex concepts. I remember really having to wrap my head around some of them for a very long time. But I've noticed that my career is like my previous career as a market researcher. Quite a lot of the time would be spent kind of with the kind of smokes and mirrors, dazzling people with ideas they didn't really understand. What I really want to do is make all this really advanced thinking really accessible, to humanize it. I think here I'm kind of inspired by one of my heroes, poetic heroes, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who kind of kicked off the Romantic movement in around 1790 or something. I don't know, rubbish of dates. And they wrote a manifesto saying they wanted to kind of use the language of the common person, and they wanted to use natural metaphors, and they wanted to change poetry from being something that was lofty and inaccessible and about religion to something that was more democratic. I think that's kind of what we need now, that idea of sharing really advanced thinking, complex concepts in really accessible ways. I think data visualization, infographics, using all the different media tools, providing stuff in a range of different formats. I think all that starts to get at this, so that you're kind of hitting people in the way that they want to be, or the way they're receptive to different styles of learning, different kind of interests with media, different cultural references, and so on. Using all that to kind of illustrate and communicate these kind of important concepts. The next point is to understand artists as practitioners of advanced thinking, bringing artivism deep within organisational decision making. And I think kind of here I've always been interested in the arts and what it is the arts do. And there is this general idea that art should be useless, that it doesn't have a point, that it's about kind of self-expression. But there's one thing we know about art, is that art is many things, and it changes. It doesn't change, its priorities shift based on the context. I think right now, the tools that artists are, the kind of mindset, the ability to experiment and to move around with new technologies, that's the domain of artists. And by bringing in their mindset into organisations, one, kind of organizations and business and the logic of capitalism and the market can benefit from this enhanced ability to see opportunities and affordances and to kind of, well, I mean, the possibilities are endless. The thing getting in the way is would be the value exchange. I mean, business needs to become more ethical, needs to develop its kind of moral consciousness in order for this to work. So there needs to be a kind of, it's happening now, I guess, with the creative economy and the cultural economy. But how that value exchange, what that value exchange looks like, is going to be an interesting question. But the potential is huge. And artivism, I think like artivism, kind of, the key figure would be Banksy, or the kind of protest placards you see in Extinction Rebellion, all the kind of stuff you see on the walls and kind of being plastered around Shoreditch. I think like that kind of form of artivism, it's often not been considered a proper form of art. You wouldn't get into art college if you were a kind of stenciler or graffiti artist. But I think it has a real place. It kind of communicates quite important concepts and ideas quite clearly, and everyone kind of likes it as well, right? And so by integrating artivism into the very fabric of business, I was thinking one thing you could do is start kind of getting organizations to fill their walls with different artists and urban artists that the employees want to support, just so you've got these kind of messages on the wall, the writings on the wall, so that again people can transcend and think differently and reflect on how alternative ways of working. The next is to kind of integrate thinking from the critical post-humanities into existing design processes. I guess for the last 3 years I've been kind of helping out at the London College of Communication Design school, and been learning a lot about design. But what I've really realised is design needs to be directed. It needs to have like a kind of force to kind of push it in a direction. Otherwise it just can become used for anything, So the critical post-humanities is a kind of burgeoning area of thinking, which is kind of a treasure trove of ideas. I'm not going to talk too much about the critical post-humanities now. I think probably I'll do my next kind of visual diary or visual essay on the critical post-humanities. But by kind of integrating that into design processes, I think we can get somewhere really interesting. And the final point on kind of how things what we'll do is to link progressive businesses, emerging subcultures, media providers and institutions together. And this is essentially a mapping and networking exercise. We're finding all the people that are kind of doing cool stuff, really progressive thinkers, getting them all working together so that they can all start buying each other's stuff and creating the market of the future, so that kind of all the undesirable elements can hopefully just fade into the distance and out of existence. So yeah, I'm going to end it there. That was a kind of quick summary of the Extinction Ethnography Manifesto. Thanks.